Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Great Depression. Here we move a little bit from what the Depression looked like and into what were what were leaders specifically trying to do about the Depression. I mean, people were trying to do what they could do, but what they could do was limited, right? I mean, how do you find a job if there's no jobs? How do you pay rent if you have no money? And so we'd already looked at some of these images, the hunger strikes, repatriation down in the bottom left, the bread lines, frankly, which must have been worse for Black America than white America, and that's hard to imagine. And if all of that wasn't enough, in the 1930s, from 1931 to 1939, with probably the single worst year being 1935, a environmental crisis of epic proportions hit much of the United States, from the Great Plains, which was struck hardest, but the effects of the Dust Bowl were felt as far to the east as Washington, D.C. The Dust Bowl is a name given to what you see there in the middle, a dust storms that carried with them topsoil, and literally probably as high as 40 to 50 feet high, kind of just went through communities, making it hard to breathe, hard to see. There were eyewitness accounts that said you always had grit in your teeth. And some living things died from the Dust Bowl, whether it be birds, whether it be young children who, after inhaling so much dust, developed pneumonia, where their lungs couldn't deal with the amount of dust that they had. People wore masks, obviously, tried to keep the dust out of their homes. And it's in this that you kind of like go, really, I mean, is this God's bad idea of a joke? And just like we saw music being sung about the Depression itself, Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? Also in your reader, you'll find lyrics to a song we're about to hear, and there's just going to be a slideshow that goes along with it, giving you images from the Dust Bowl. But the song is called Dust Bowl Blues, and by a very famous musician of the time, Woody Guthrie, who moved out to California during the Dust Bowl crisis, as did many former sharecroppers and farmers in the Oklahoma, Kansas range. That's where you get the word, I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but Okies. Okies were Oklahoma people from Oklahoma who moved usually to California. But what ended up happening in California is you had this huge influx of people who were willing to work for whatever job and whatever pay they could get. And so the Dust Bowl is the environmental crisis, but it creates a refugee crisis that leads to more economic problems that only exacerbate the effects of the Great Depression. And so let's go ahead and listen to Woody Guthrie's Dust Bowl Blues.
I just blowed in and I got them Dust Bowl blues. I just blowed in and I got them Dust Bowl blues. I just blowed in and I'll blow back out again. I guess you've heard about every kind of blues. I guess you've heard about every kind of blues. But when the dust gets high, you can't even see the sky. I've seen the dust so black that I couldn't see a thing. I've seen the dust so black that I couldn't see a thing. And the wind so cold, boy, it nearly cut your water off. I seen the wind so high that it blowed my fences down. I seen the wind so high that it blowed my fences down. Buried my tractor 6 feet underground. Well, it turned my farm into a pile of sand. Yes, it turned my farm into a pile of sand. I had to hit that road with a bundle in my hand. I spent 10 years down in that old dust bowl. I spent 10 years down in that old dust bowl. When you get that dust pneumonia, boy, it's time to go. I had a gal and she was young and sweet. I had a gal and she was young and sweet. But a dust storm buried her 1,600 feet. She was a good gal, long, tall, and stout. Yes, she was a good gal, long, tall, and stout. I had to get a steam shovel just to dig my darling out. These dusty blues are the dustiest ones I know. These dusty blues are the dustiest ones I know. Buried head over heels in the black old dust. I had to pack up and go, and I just blowed in, and I'll soon blow out again.
So you see the enormity of the area covered by the Dust Bowl. You might go, why was so much dust blowing? Well, let's go back to World War I. A lot of demand for food, more farmland that had been part of the Great Plains was dug up. And these areas, the dust had been held in place by this really strong Great Plains grass. And you dig that up and the wind comes and there's nothing to hold the dust in place. And so you get this massive environmental crisis that leads to images that are famous, like Migrant Mother at Nipomo in California, close to Santa Barbara. You get people moving, stalled probably on Route 66 in the California desert. You get these before and after images of 15 minutes separating them. This is a town in Kansas, Garden City. 15 minutes later, this is what it looks like after a dust storm is hit. And then I think it had talked about, the jackrabbits perishing from suffocation, but oftentimes people went on what were called jackrabbit drives, because as there was a drought, not only were people starving to death, but animals were starving to death. And so the jackrabbits would come out of the hills and eat what little food had actually made it to harvest. And so townspeople would gather and just round up the rabbits and just club them over the head. It's pretty hardcore, the Dust Bowl could be. And so kind of you think, wow, so what were people doing, And a lot of people simply, some people wrote to people and asked them for help. And I'm just asking you right now, and you see it's Journal 35, but for you, I believe this is Journal 12. And the first question in Journal 12 was, if you could ask one living person for anything, or a person for anything, who would it be? Who would you ask? And what would you ask for? Kind of think about that. But as you know, the second part to the question was asking you to look in your RSJ reader on pages 62 to 64 to see a series of letters that children wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt, who will become the first lady once her husband Franklin Roosevelt is elected president. She is, in my estimation, the greatest first lady the United States has ever seen, because she was a person who had no airs about her. She wasn't overwhelmed with who she was or what place she was in. She understood that everyone, including minorities, were just as good as everyone else. So she is a first lady who really helped lead the entire nation. But also, interestingly, and this will be coming up in a video in a second, she was her husband's legs. Franklin, her husband, had been stricken with polio as an adult in the early 1920s and had lost use of his legs. And so as president, when he needed someone to go out and check out something, he often would have his wife Eleanor do that for him. Now, interestingly, and you can look this up, they had an interesting marriage. Franklin had been a known philanderer as a young man prior to polio, and really that had driven a wedge between their love as a couple, as a loving couple. And then there are other people who say, you know, it's very possible that Eleanor fell in love with another woman during this time period. And while there's a lot of evidence that suggests that, there's not any like specific incontrovertible evidence. I did talk to her niece, lived in Davis for years. Her name was Eleanor Roosevelt. And her niece came and spoke to Davis High. And one time a kid actually asked her, was your aunt a lesbian? And the niece, I was horrified, as you can imagine, as a teacher. And the niece kind of looked out to the crowd. She was probably in her 70s at this point, the niece, and said, she could have been, but it doesn't really matter because of all the good things she had done. And so what I want you to think about as you do that journal is, you know, what was different about what you asked versus what the kids asked versus that image that was in the journal for online of the letter Peter, age 8, wrote to Michelle Obama while she was first lady. What were the different things? And I hope you guys see that these kids were asking not for things they wanted, but things they needed. There's a big difference between what you want and what you need. So some of the children are asking for things like bikes so that they can help their mother deliver the wash that she's doing. Some were asking for money to pay a doctor's bill because they knew their parents couldn't afford it, or to help pay for a refrigerator that their parents had bought, or for a Christmas present, something simple like that. Just kind of amazing that the kids identify, that gives you an idea of what kind of person Eleanor Roosevelt was even though she was far away in Washington, D.C., they identified with her as someone who could help them. But for non-kids, who did they look for? They looked to the President of the United States. And the first president during the Depression was a man named Herbert Hoover. And I asked you, I believe in part 4, and yes, you were supposed to look at Herbert Hoover's Madison Square Garden speech in part 4, question 2. I know it says part 2 here, but that's for non-distance learning. And I believe he gave his Madison Square Garden speech in 1931, same as he gave his Lincoln Day speech, which is highlighted in this headline from the U.S. Daily newspaper, February 13th, 1931. Does this headline fit with Hoover's Madison Square Garden speech? And the answer should be yes. In both the Madison Square Garden speech and here, he's talking about the individual should overcome their own problems. The government should not solve your problems. Read that, the sub-headline, solution of problems of depression by individuals and communities without leaning on the federal government. Herbert Hoover is consistent. You might not agree with it, but he's consistent. He did the same thing in World War I when he said, you know, we shouldn't force people to conserve food. People should do it because they're convinced it's the right moral thing to do. The government shouldn't force people to do something in the Depression. People should help each other. But what he doesn't understand is, how can you rely on yourself? How can you rely on other people when, you know, by 1931, you're probably looking at 20% of the population is out of work, which means they don't have money, which means they can't really help themselves nor their neighbors. But for Hoover, it's an ideal that is central to his being, is that if you see him here and he's, as president, standing on, these are called, you know, it's a thing you have out in a bay that keeps the water, like in hurricanes, from coming in. It's a breakwater, I think is what it's called, because it stops the waves from coming in. And you can see that this is protecting Washington, D.C. the Capitol, the Washington Monument in the background. And what are the things he believes builds the strongest wall are tariffs, how you control trade. But look at the second one. Look at the fifth one. Individual liberty, individual responsibility. That the government should be there to protect you against the mob, like he would have thought the bonus army was. That the government shouldn't inflate its currency. So we don't just print money when people need money. When, if you go back to the causes of the Depression, the governor of the Federal Reserve said that's exactly what they should have been doing, pumping money into the economy. That's exactly what we're doing today. And Hoover said, well, if you need that, then let's rely on the banks. But back then, the banks were closing. Where do you go? You know, and so little kids are thinking, Eleanor Roosevelt, you can solve my problems once you become first lady. And people are looking at him saying, solve our problems. He's going, no, I can't. That's not the job of the government. This will have to hold. And if it doesn't hold, eventually we'll get better. And so you can imagine why in the election of 32, it seemed like such a clear choice between Herbert Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt. Herbert Hoover, seen as kind of not smug, but negative, sour-faced. In September of 1932, 3 months before the election, 2 months before the election, he had barricaded himself inside the White House during the bonus army crisis? Or do you trust Franklin Roosevelt, whose campaign theme is happy days are here again, who had overcome the effects of polio to become governor of New York, who had an incredibly positive outlook on life because he felt it couldn't get any worse than what I had experienced? And here you see them riding to inauguration, the March 4th cover of the New Yorker. Here it is in reality. Franklin Roosevelt staying seated because he did not have the use of his legs. But Hoover having the wherewithal to actually go to inauguration to welcome in his successor. The day before inauguration, the Philadelphia Record had this cartoon. What point is the cartoonist trying to make in this cartoon? And I hope you see that it's Roosevelt just won't use Hoover's policies. Here's Herbert Hoover walking away with his bag that says HH. And in the garbage, that FDR, you can see it on the front of his vest, is taking out. Notice they have FDR walking. Many Americans didn't know he couldn't walk. But the garbage that he's taking out are Hoover's ideas. The rugged individualism, the car in every garage, the chicken in every pot, the concept of prosperity is right around the corner. They just wait it out and rely on your good old-fashioned American I-can-do spirit. That's the day before inauguration. And then FDR gives his inaugural address. And the inaugural address is supposed to be part 5. You know, the questions basically are right there. You know, what is meant by when he said the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, which we'll watch a short video clip of. If we were in class, and we will be going over this in depth, is, you know, what did he say he would do in his inaugural address? And what parts of his speech would be most alarming? Now, interestingly, you see FDR standing and taking the oath of office from, I believe, Charles Evans Hughes. And to FDR's right, the balding, kind of younger looking tall man is his son, who was always there to help FDR manage, quote unquote, walking, because FDR couldn't do it without the help of his supports, both supports. And so often his son would walk him in so he could use his son as one support and use maybe one walking support as another tool. But notice how he walks in so that no one can see that FDR has a physical disability, that he cannot use his legs. FDR was very careful of projecting the image that my disability does not prevent me from being normal. I don't want you to know, because it didn't matter to him. But it mattered that he didn't want the American people at this time to see it. So let's watch, I think this is about 50 seconds long, of FDR entering the inauguration. It comes from C-SPAN. with 2 policemen in front. And then you'll see FDR kind of moving, swaying back and forth as he comes down, his arm interlocked with the sun, but it's a slow pace. See them kind of showing up. They've got their hats on still. Chief Justice moves in. And there you go. So then FDR gives his inaugural speech, in which he says, and you can see him standing at the podium, which he says, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And here you see an image that I don't know where it came from, but I found it, and I think it's such an interesting phrase that FDR certainly would have agreed with, is fear is a liar. And I want you to see how people reacted to his speech. And so we'll watch a short clip from the Century America's Time right now.
I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
On Inauguration Day, nearly 100,000 people braved a cold March morning to hear what the new president would do.
This great nation will endure as it has endured. Let me assert
That magnificent resonance coming out.
the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
We have nothing to fear but fear itself. And everybody would look at each other, they'd nod their head.
Let us unite.
And when he'd say, my friends, everybody could feel he was talking to him. That was one of his friends, that was one of his people.
And me, a little black boy, down in Georgia, hearing that voice over the radio, you know, I felt it. It wasn't that he told it to Daddy and Daddy told it to me, or told it to Mama and me. No, he was talking to little Ossie sitting there listening to him. He could, through the magic of his voice and radio, reach out and involve you in the great adventure of making America work again.
And notice what Ossie Davis said well before Donald Trump became president under the slogan, Make America Great Again. That's not what Ossie Davis said. He said, make America work again. Americans back then didn't believe America wasn't great. It just wasn't working the way it should work. And that was Roosevelt's job, was to tell people in his inaugural speech what he would do. And this was question 2 in part 5, where I had you looking at the only thing that we have to fear is fear itself, as well as what we're going to do. What did he say? Number 1, and these are all in quotes, they're from his inaugural address. Our greatest primary task is to put people to work. And look at what this guy's sign is. Work is what I want, not charity. Who will help me get a job? You know, I mean, I don't want charity. This is what Hoover was saying, charity will hurt people. Well, I don't want charity. I just want a job. And so what FDR is saying is maybe the government can help put people to work in public programs. Maybe we should build things in America where we, like dams, like roads, like hospitals, where we can put people to work. We also need a strict supervision of banking so that these things don't happen again. Bank runs. How did this happen? We got to look at our banking system and make it healthy and trustworthy so people put their money back in banks so we can get the multiplier effect going so that banks can lend out money and get the engine of the American economy roaring again. He also said there should be an end to speculation with other people's money. He meant loans on margin. He meant we shouldn't be tying up money that we're lending out to people to the stock market, because that's gambling in essence. And he also said at the end of his speech, I want broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency, against the depression, against what you're looking at in this image. the coffee and donut lines, the free soup lines, the Hoovervilles. This is a war. Interestingly, when in President Biden's inaugural address on January 20th, 2021, he said he needed to wage a war against the coronavirus. And not just against the virus itself, but against what it has caused. And so this is the headline from the Chicago Sunday Tribune on March 5th, 1933, the day after Roosevelt gave his inaugural address. And you can see that the headline is Roosevelt Charts Bank Aid. How do we help the banks? But also over on the right, you see other headlines. 100,000 cheer, first address of president. Chicago goes on for a day without banks. And that FDR promises quick action and then starts to work. And the subheadline is for dictatorship if necessary. What part of the headline suggests a possibly divisive part of FDR's speech? And I hope you see it's his statement. I'm going to use broad executive power. When he said that in speech, people said, that sounds like a dictator. Are you going to be a dictator? Are you saying that if worse comes to worse, you'll be a dictator? Even the New York Times on their headline on March 11th, 7 days after the inaugural address, says Roosevelt gets power of a dictator. Congress backs grant of authority to president unprecedented in our history. Would FDR become a dictator? What would he do? Is he for dictatorship if necessary? Was he given the powers of a dictator? Well, we're going to find out when we get to his actual plan, which is called the New Deal.